Hi, everybody. Welcome to this event. I'm Ray Blades. I'm the editor for Ontario Outdoors magazine, and this is the first ever OFAH Inside Access event. It's a firearms policy Q&A. This is a live virtual Q&A event with OFAH staff. We have hundreds of people registered for the event from all over Ontario and even outside, which is fantastic to see. We're scheduled to go tonight from 7 to 9 p.m. We are recording this session and intend to post it online. To get back to a few of the Q&A people here, we're going to be posting it online at www.ofah.org/inside access. That's www.ofah.org/inside access, and on the OFH YouTube channel sometime after the event. Because of the number of the participants, the audience will be viewing on mute and without video to keep the background noise to a minimum and make sure everybody can hear, which is a good thing because I know a few of you hoodlums out there and I don't want anybody tossing virtual tomatoes at me or my esteemed guests here. We had hundreds of questions come in through the registration process, which is fantastic to see. We will also be trying to get to as many people as possible, as well as answer some from the live audience as we go. We won't, however, be able to get through to every single one of these questions tonight. Unfortunately, there's just too much to cover, ground to cover. So our behind the scenes communication specialist, Sean Kelly, will be putting some info up there. What email were we going to go with, guys, so people could follow up with? Is that going to be like Angela Lombardo at, no, I don't think, I think it's, we're going to go with firearms@ofah.org.
Yeah.
So again, Sean will be posting that information for everyone to follow up with. And if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of the OFH in general. If you want to ask a question during the meeting, use the Q&A function. You should see that somewhere on the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So without further ado, with us here tonight are Matt DeMille. He is the manager of Fish and Wildlife Services, a registered lobbyist for the OFAH. Matt leads OFH policy and conservation program teams. Excuse me, he actively works on federal firearms policy and represents the OFAH at Queen's Park and Parliament Hill. And up until just very recently, he used to be the president of the OFAH Hipsters Beard Club. But alas, he is no longer part of that bearded community. I mean, he's still, I guess, technically in the club, but I mean, it's really on the fringes with what he's bringing his game with tonight. So it's a great loss because I thought I did some great mentor work with him with that, but it wasn't meant to be. So welcome, Matt. I never even thought about that until I actually just wrote that down of welcome, Matt. So
yeah, thanks, Ray.
I'm not even going to go over there with that. Also with us tonight is Brian McRae. He is the Senior Advisor for Community and Partner Relations at the OFAH. He works on all things firearms, which is good to know because I have a problem with my fore end of my shotgun, and I hope we can do some gunsmithing with it after the event. He is also the staff liaison for the OFH Firearms Advisory Committee and leads OFH efforts on firearms issues at the municipal level, and we have a lot of questions on the municipal level, so we're going to try and get to them a bit tonight. He's also a recent new dad, so those bags under the eyes you see are not just him up all late nights answering gun-related questions. He's changing diapers too. He's a Renaissance man, firearms expert, and diaper changer. Congrats to Brian and his family. And you also see he just won a free haircut from his local Lions Club. So congratulations on that one too there. He got it in nice, so.
Thanks, Ray. You got to support local, right? You got to support local.
Exactly, why don't you? So of all the questions that came in from our pre-registration, one of my favorite ones was from Heath S. from Torrey Hill. And he simply asked in the registration for the event, when asked, what do you like to discuss about firearms policy? He simply said, everything. And we're going to try to get to everything tonight, honestly, but I don't know if we're going to get to all of everything tonight. So we're going to do our best here. Guys, so there's a lot of talk about the firearms community, and I might use a little bit of air quotes throughout the night here. You know, we're one big happy family, but to me, it seems that we're we're fractured. There's obviously divisions in our country about firearms issues in the general public, but more importantly, it's very apparent to me as the editor of Ontario Outdoors that there's division within our firearms community. Readers have asked, I've talked to readers, for the last 20 years on firearms issues, but readers asked, especially in the last 12 months, it seems to be a real hotbed time of things that are going on with firearms and the law. They asked sort of two bookend questions to me. One is, do the gun laws change affect me as a hunter? Is my shotgun and is my bolt action rifle going to be banned? And when they hear that the answer is no, then they're fine with it. They're fine with whatever is going on with the law. They say, Ontario Outdoors is a hunting magazine. It's not a gun magazine, so we should have no concern with handguns and assault rifles, right? And then on the other spectrum, I hear from readers that say, keep on telling us, firearms owners throughout this country are under attack on a daily basis, and we need to do something about it. We need to do more about it in the magazine, and the OD needs to put a focus on covering more things besides just hunting rifles that the firearms community is under attack about. So I struggle with this as an editor. I really think, to some extent, they're both right. But how do you guys deal with the chasm of this in terms of OFH policy?
Well, you took a hard left turn there. You were quite a comedian to start, and then you got really serious on us right away. And that's probably one of the hardest questions to answer. I thought maybe you'd start with a softball, but it's a big challenge for us. I think it's something that we face every day. It's really, it's not just firearms. It's everything that we deal with, whether it's fishing or hunting. Is that we have a very diverse audience. Whether it's members, whether it's people who support in other ways, whether it's people who just follow along. Is that when we talk about hunting, when we talk about fishing, when we talk about firearms, is that everyone has different perspectives, and there's a broad range of interests, and people come at it from different traditions. They come at it from different things that they do, and I think that sometimes we focus so much on the differences between people within the firearms community that we forget about some of that common ground. And I think that we constantly try and bring people back to that. And I think one of the fortunate positions we're in, it's unfortunate and fortunate. It's unfortunate in the sense that we're a bit of a punching bag, because you're in the middle, and there's a lot of people that want you to be there, and they want you to represent the interests of firearms owners in general, at the policy level. But there's also that constant kind of tug from both sides that says, you need to be stronger, as you said, or you need to be doing this less. We get a question constantly about, how does this have anything to do with OFAH? You're a hunting organization, so why do you care about this? And so we're constantly answering those questions, and it's a unique opportunity for us as an organization. And I think it's unlike maybe other organizations that, they have a very focused interest, whether it's on firearms or whether it's on something else, is that OFAH has, that diverse audience. And so, we look at things from a number of different perspectives, and regardless of what policy we're looking at, we're constantly thinking about, how does this affect everyone? What are the different ways that this is going to affect people? And we come at it from, I think it is a middle ground perspective, because we don't advocate for one group over the other. We don't look at firearms, as individual firearms or types of firearms. We often try and cut through that and look at the policy behind it. And there's underlying policy behind, or there's underlying similarities in the policy related to firearms, just like there's underlying similarities between firearms owners. Is that you got to look for that common ground. And we actually find that that's the safest place for us as an organization to be, is to be talking about firearms from that perspective. Is that we don't take an all or nothing approach to it. We don't just come at it from one perspective. We're constantly looking at it and trying to understand what is the policy, what does it mean, and what are the implications for our members and the people within the broader hunting community, broader firearms community. Because we know that there are going to be things that maybe at first blush people say, well, this doesn't affect me. That's nothing to do with me. I don't have a handgun. I can't hunt with handguns. And so we get that all the time, is that
Mm.
we don't often come at it to say, you know what, we need to protect handguns. We absolutely need to protect handguns. Is we look at it by saying, okay, if there's a bad policy related to handguns, then the conversation around that is going to affect all firearms owners. And some people don't buy into that. They say, you know what, if it's not about hunting firearms, it's not about hunting firearms, and you don't have a place in that conversation. But I think that we constantly look at it and say, you know what, there are things that, we're all facing as a firearms community related to bad policy. There are people that don't understand within the general public that they don't have firearms. They've never had firearms. They've never been around firearms. They don't understand firearms use. They don't even understand the existing firearms policies. And we have an opportunity to educate people. And that unique opportunity for us is that we have that opportunity not just in the general public. We don't have to go very far. We can go within our own membership to talk to people
Right.
about firearm use, whether they're, just an angler and they don't have their own firearms, never been around firearms, or, whether they're just a hunter who uses hunting firearms, or maybe there's someone who has hunting firearms, but they also have firearms that they use for recreational shooting. And then we also have members who are recreational shooters, and they belong to a shooting club that is an OFH affiliated shooting club. So we have that entire spectrum within our organization. And so we just try and break through it, and not try and get. I think sometimes it's almost like, people want to impose their kind of beliefs or their thinking onto us as individuals or us as an organization. And we've always had the best success when we we don't surprise people. We are who we are, and
Mhm.
we really try and take that evidence-based approach to all policy. Again, like whether it's fishing, hunting, or firearms, it's all the same. And so we take that approach in firearms just the same. And I think that sometimes doesn't get that sort of headline that people want. They want it that, we either are for or against. You're either with us or against us is
Right.
kind of the mentality, and we hear all the time. And so we try and really break through that.
I think one of the great things about the OFH, like you're saying, that you do reach out to that broader, um, you have a broader reach than just being a firearms organization. And it's not exactly great an analogy, but with Ontario to Doors, if we were just a hunting magazine or we were just a fishing magazine, we wouldn't be reaching those other people. And it gives me so much great, joy when I hear back from readers that say, you know what, I didn't grow up in a hunting family. I've never hunted in my life. I don't own a firearm, but I'm an avid angler. I've been reading Ontario to Doors for the last 3 years. I picked it up, and I'm really interested in hunting now. I'm really interested in either doing bow hunting, or I've read some articles on waterfowl hunting, and it's just that we have that broad reach that we can talk to, not just talk to our congregation, or we can talk to people outside of it in a bit on a different level. And I think that makes both of us, OFH and OD, unique in a lot of ways, that and for that.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is that, we're kind of when it comes to policy, it tends to be boring. It's not going to catch headlines. It's not going to be that the tweet or a social media post that is going to get everyone riled up, because it takes time. We methodically go through the policy. We kind of turn it over many times to try and figure out what it means. We try and get answers. We try and get clarification on what it actually means. And sometimes that means that we don't come out with positions right away. We don't come out with hardline policy statements, because it's often a mix. It's a mix of things that maybe it's filling a policy gap and it's needed, and maybe the rest of the bill or the legislation, and maybe the rest of it is no good. But it's hardly ever black and white, and we have trouble getting people um, to get past that idea that we don't have to be on either end of the spectrum, meaning that we don't have to take a hardline position to say we are for or against this. Is that often it's, we don't like what's there because of X, Y, and Z, and here's how we want you to change it, is really that kind of constructive approach. And so it's getting people to the point where they'll actually say, okay, I'm reading into this, I'm looking into this. I think when the OIC came out last year. It took us, I think it was about 4 weeks before we got our letter into the minister, and we sent the minister a letter, and it was 12 pages long. And it really unpacked everything. Well, and we know people aren't going to read that. And
Right.
it is a challenge that you almost have to do the policy advocacy work, get right down in the weeds, and then you've got to try and come back out and have a conversation with people. And oftentimes they're like, I don't care about the details. I just want you to not like this legislation. And I want you to go all out, all or nothing. Let's get rid of the legislation. And sometimes that's a hard position to be in, because when you're trying to have a conversation with, any party, whether it's, the government party, and whether you like or don't like the bill, is that, that sort of kind of open-mindedness and having a conversation about, and providing that constructive feedback to say, this is why we don't like this. There is evidence to say that this doesn't make sense. And so, we don't often, get that ability to, have a detailed conversation. And even like this, we're having more of a dialogue about it. And, if we talk to a member on the phone and we have a conversation, oftentimes they understand where we're coming from, but sometimes that takes 15, 20,
Right.
30, 45 minutes, and you don't always have that.
And policy isn't sexy until it affects you, right? Until something comes down and you're saying, hey, this is not just something that's highfalutin. This is actually affecting how I interact in my daily life, right? Or in my sporting life. So
Well, in advocacy too, when we start to go out and talk about these things, is that I think that, that there's also there's a lot of noise in the firearms world. It's a very, very emotional topic, and on all sides of the conversation. And so people have trouble just cutting through that noise to even know what's going on. So the confusion, it just makes the conversation that much harder, because you have to get over the noise. You have to get through, what doesn't actually even exist, or may not be the exact issue that is out there, that or the policy concern, to even have a good conversation about it. And we often find ourselves in a community where we're talking, we have, you described that, the differences of opinions, and so we have this infighting, and it's like bad family drama. It's like, don't talk about the divisiveness. Like that's only going to make us weaker, right?
no, I think why
But
I wanted to start with the divisiveness is because I think that's the elephant in the room for a lot of people, right? It's like, well, it's either we're one big happy family, or we're gonna punch the out of each other, right? And it's just, we have to, like, if we want to get forward with any of this stuff, I think you have to have proper dialogue, and you have to maybe not necessarily like what other people are doing or how other people see things. We run, what we'd call black guns in the magazine, what are legal hunting firearms, non-restricted firearms in the magazine. And we get letters lots of times saying, why are you running that stuff in a magazine? That's not a hunting gun. So, well, it's a .308 caliber. It's a legal, non-restricted firearm. It will, I know it doesn't have an English walnut stock in a bolt, in a single bolt, like a bolt action gun. But I said it's a legal firearm. But then you get into start arguing about aesthetics and stuff like that, and that's like all the stuff you're talking about, the nitpicking and the looking for ways for us to be different, that rather than looking for ways for us to be one on issues, right?
yeah, and that it becomes a challenge when we only talk to ourselves. I think we learn a lot. Brian and I having conversations with our members who have much more intimate knowledge in specific aspects of the policies that we're dealing with, because they live it. It's really important to them. And so having that diversity actually allows us, from a policy perspective, to draw on that, to understand how it's impacting people beyond the kind of obvious things. And it allows us to talk to them about that kind of polarization within the community. And so we it would be nice to just talk amongst friends and just have everyone just agree, like that.
Right.
That would be amazing, but it doesn't happen. It's not reality. And so we constantly find ourselves having disagreements with almost everyone we talk to about it. And I actually think it ends up making the conversation stronger, but we have to be able to get outside of our own community with that sort of solidarity, not solidarity in the way that everyone believes the exact same thing. I don't think that's ever going to happen, nor should it. But we have to have the solidarity in finding that common ground, and at least to have, good conversations. And I think for us, that kind of the advocacy that we do is that, we take pride in not just having conversations with the people who already believe what we believe or what we think is right, and having them repeat back to us that, yes, you're right, and get a pat on the back. Is that we actually go into places where we know people aren't going to agree with us, whether that's, in our own forums, with our own members who don't necessarily, like a position that we've taken, or whether it's, on the complete other side, or whether it's in, Queen's Park or Parliament Hill, and we're having a conversation with someone who has completely different ideologies about firearms or hunting or whatever. Is that it's our role as an organization to, through advocacy, to convince those people that don't already believe what we believe, that what we're doing has merit, that it's important, that, our perspectives are important, so that we can try and, convince them that that needs to be incorporated into legislation, policy, whatever that may be. If you're always preaching to the converted and you're getting a pat on the back, you feel good about it. You feel really good about it. You go home at the end of the day and you sleep well, but you're not making a difference. And I think that we've always had those hard conversations, whether it's, spring bear hunt, or, whether it's something else that we're dealing with Fish and Wildlife Management, or firearms. Is that you got to have those hard conversations. That's the only way that you're actually going to make change with decision makers who don't believe what you believe.
Those must be some hard conversations, I'm sure. One of the big questions that comes up, especially in the last year, like I talk about the hot button issue, is that this disinformation, and I guess disinformation from both sides. Last spring, about this time, just probably, a few weeks into the turkey season, I had an OPP officer call me, and he says he wanted to know if 12 gauge shotguns were prohibited. He said that he heard that they were, and I said they weren't, and we had a great existential discussion about how to disprove a negative. So three questions come out. There's different disinformation, a fair amount out there. Bob N from Kingston writes in. He says, "I've heard so much different information. I simply want to be better informed." How can Bob go about doing that?
So I'll take a stab at this one. So obviously, this was a time frame where, much like OOD, OFAH was getting bombarded with questions as well, and through those times, we actually created an FAQ on our website that will answer a lot of those questions, and it's at www.ofah.org/firearms. That's a great spot to start. In particular, there is an FAQ. If you scroll back down the list a little bit, back to May of 2020. They would be able to get some information there.
Okay, so some specific questions we have right around shotguns is Howard L. from Sudbury. He writes in, is my 12 gauge legal? And Marie 2F from Woodbridge asks, is my 10 gauge shotgun banned? So I know we've had a lot of information, a lot of questions about shotguns, especially in the magazine, and those are two of the big ones.
Yeah, so that's actually a trick question, because obviously we don't know what exact shotgun they have, that they're talking about. But in general, this is where a lot of the confusion came in back in May. That initially people thought that all 12 gauge and 10 gauge shotguns were prohibited, and they were, there was a lot of discussion about the choke systems making it, if it had a interchangeable choke, that it was going to be prohibited. And in fact, and when you dig into it, it actually wasn't the prohibitions on the actual gauge of the shotgun, whether it be a 12 gauge or a 10 gauge. What it was is what they prescribed were the bore diameters. And through our discussions with government, in particular public safety, as we kind of dove through all of the questions that we were receiving from our members, we got the confirmation and basically that if 12 gauge or 10 gauge shotguns were easily identifiable and marked as such, they fell within the legal requirements of being still a firearm that people could use. So, at the end of the day, we had a lot of calls coming in as well, because people were, as you said, it was right in turkey season, and they were in your situation, the sun was out in the bush, and I know Matt and I received a lot of calls that were we're going out the next day. And, as soon as we got the information that basically indicated that if the shotgun was identifiable, then it's acceptable as being under that threshold under the bore diameter, which was 20 millimeters.
Okay. Maybe this one might be good from Matt, though. And call me crazy, and there's a number of people in my life that do, that I thought we lived in a parliamentary democracy. I probably should have paid a bit more attention through grade 10 Canadian history class, but I never heard of an IOC. You mentioned an OIC, sorry, earlier, until about this time last year. What is an OIC? And Matt from Fort Frances asks, how is it legal?
Yeah, so this is one of the most common things we heard coming out of the May 2020 prohibitions, and so it was done through an OIC as an ordering council, and it's really just a policy. I think they would call it a policy instrument that government can use. In this case specifically, it's through Governor and Council, which is cabinet, and so the federal cabinet can provide that direction. So it's a recommendation coming from cabinet. And so it doesn't go through that regular parliamentary process. So it is something that is used. It at times is used quite frequently. It tends to be used for things where it's already been established that it can be. And in this case, through the criminal code, it does allow for it to happen. So you can make regulations prescribing firearms as prohibited through an ordering council. And so is it legal? Is there a legal mechanism to do it? Yes. We took exception with the process that they used, in that there were major changes to the classification of firearms. They were classifying firearms based on models as opposed to going through the regular classification process. And so we took exception with that way of doing things. So it's
I think a lot of our readership was that way too. It just seems like a backhanded way to kind of get something pushed through, back channels, and without, wanting to go through the proper channels. Put it out there. Let's have a vote on it in Parliament and see what happens, right? But
yep, yeah. So it's just one of those things where I'm assuming the government was just looking for the path of least resistance, and they said, we've got this mechanism, let's use it. And they did, and they knew it would be contentious, and parliamentary process would have been a completely kind of different conversation for sure.
So you touched on this a little bit about what guns were going on the list, and it was a big issue for our readership last year with what was going on in the OIC. And we were trying to keep on top of it in a magazine with updates on updating the list and news and what guns were on it and what weren't, to try and keep a running tally on this. And it seemed like every week there were updates from the governments, and readers were asking, is Bill Blair just sitting there flipping through catalogs and going, this week that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. And a number of people that pre-registered for this asked, Jim B from Coppercliff and Laura E from Lefroy, they kind of asked the same question. What is the criteria for putting guns on that list?
So there's a few different things. So Brian touched on the bore diameter restriction. So there was that. There was a muzzle velocity restriction. And so that was another kind of open-ended criteria that they used. And then the one I just referred to was prescribing firearms based on the model of the firearm, and then all the known variants for those models. And so that list, it actually, it kind of grew and grew and grew, because it wasn't, it was actually prescribed in the legislation where they said these firearms, and they listed them. They said that, these are the ones. And so there's the government rationale, which was they're military style firearms. That's what we heard. That was the narrative. That was what was in the media. We're banning military style firearms. The challenge with that is that there's no definition of military style firearms. And so they were using criteria. And so they said it had to be a semi-auto action with sustained rapid fire capability. So they had other things in there related to tactical and military design, with large magazine capacity.
I think when most people think of military style firearms, and that's what you're getting at, they're the modern tactical stuff. They think of the Canadian military. They might be thinking of an AR-10 or the machine guns of like a C6 or a C9 and stuff like that. But in reality, again, I'm using air quotes because that's what the government is using the term is military guns. There's a lot of military guns used by Canadians, right? We can go and look at historically the Lee Enfield, the M1 Garand, I believe even, and I hate picking out guns especially with this audience because I know there's so many more specialists in this audience than I am for a lot of guns, but I believe even like the Winchester 94, one of the most classic lever guns for Canadian hunters to use and North American hunters and even people around the world. The Winchester 94 was issued at one time by the Canadian forces. So you could classify all of those guns as military guns, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the challenge, and I think that from a this is exactly what we're talking about with kind of tackling it from a policy perspective. Is we looked at the criteria and we said well, semi-auto isn't defining because they didn't get rid of all semi-autos. It was that idea of rapid fire, and it was the high magazine, the ability to take a large capacity magazine, and those two things by law, it already made it illegal for people to do those things, and so it was a red herring really from the start. This idea of military style, and they weren't actually, as you're suggesting, even looking at actual kind of military firearms from the past. And as you said, when you actually look at military or the military origins of firearms, a lot of them have them, in one way or another. And a lot of the components that you see, particularly on the modular firearms, the ones that were kind of targeted with the OIC ban, is those things come from the military because that's where the innovation was happening around firearms for the past 100 years. And so, almost everything has military design, and even when you get down to calibers, you start to look at it, and even if something was designed for military, you look at the kind of comparable civilian market. Is that in a lot of ways what that would happen is they would have these military origins, but then when a conflict was over, they would either have a lot of surplus. That happened with 30-06 after a lot of the major conflicts in the 20th century. But then you'd also have you'd have this kind of the same companies that were making military firearms and ammunition would then create a civilian market for the technology, the calibers that were created, the firearms even. And so you can't disentangle those things in any way.
No, it's impossible. And this leads into one specific question we have from Mark H. from St. Clements. He says, are all Lee Enfield's 303 British firearms going to be banned, or is it only those with removable clips?
Yeah, and so what we find with a lot of the, sorry, went on mute there for a second. A lot of these firearms is that there's so many variations, but by and large, the firearms that I think people think things like Lee Enfield because they have that military history, is that they're part of this. They're caught up in this. Even some people think just semi-autos because it's written into the OIC that well, semi-automatics are part of the criteria. It is that, and you just said removable clips, is that those things in and of themselves, all those kind of components aren't things that are being prescribed as prohibited. So those components aren't making those firearms prohibited, and so it's really meeting the kind of criteria that they've set out. And so I think that like 303 British is a common caliber used in hunting, and the FRT, the firearms reference table that people need to use to check whether their firearms are prohibited, is in a lot of cases almost unusable. It's really hard to look for those things, but we highly recommend when people have questions about specific firearms is that they go and they look it up in the table. They try and figure out whether it's in there, and if they can't, then try and talk to the CFO, just because of the variability in the firearms that people are using. Is that it's really tough because of the huge list and the variants and everything else, that that's the place they should go.
So they need to bring a lawyer with them when they're on the
Pretty
internet.
much.
Well, I
Okay.
was going to add into that, you know, obviously for anyone who has attempted to look up a firearm on the firearms reference table, it can be a daunting task. And we heard that from a lot of folks, you know, because we were getting questions all the time about, you know, this firearm or that firearm. And again, the same website as I said before is there's actually a link. We provided the most recent list of firearms that were listed there, which should help to make your life a little bit easier if people are interested. But as Matt said, you know, beyond that, you know, call the CFO.
I know it's tough for us too, because we get a lot of questions, people asking like, there's a few questions here about semi-autos. Is my Winchester Model 100 and my Remington Woodmaster semi-automatic, are they banned now? There's a few other specific gun questions, and it's hard for us with Ontario Doors too. It's because you kind of have the list, you can direct people to that list, but they might have some different configuration that, you know, might seem like okay on this list, but it's not okay on that. And it's really tough for us to be, you know, giving out sort of information on that, or you know, valid information on it. But this is one question you touched on, the semi-autos, and that's one thing that comes up big for us too, is, and on two fronts, is that, you know, our semi-auto rifles banned, and this is the slippery slope argument, because a lot of times when you talk about banned stuff, you're talking about, for hunters anyways, you're talking about things that are not in their realms, right? You're talking about handguns, you're talking about, again, assault rifles and stuff like that, type firearms. But when you start talking about semi-automatics, I find more, especially with our readership, ears start pricking up a little bit, because not everybody has a semi-auto rifle, but they're out there a fair amount, enough for hunting situations. And then they wonder the slippery slope. If you're going to start banning semi-auto rifles, are you going to start banning semi-auto shotguns? And then where, you know, where does it start and when does it end? What feedback are you guys getting on the discussion of semi-autos in general, specifically for hunting purposes?
Well, I think I'll start by, you know, the original question with regards to, you know, the traditional, you know, the Remington 760 or the 7600, 7400, you know, what we have seen, you know, is that those firearms, they're not on the prohibition list. And I think, you know, one of the elephants in the room is, you know, many of those firearms that were prohibited look the sort of a particular firearm, right? They may not appeal to, you know, the masses. And you know, to your point about you know, the general public maybe not being educated enough on firearms and firearms policy, they're fed a constant barrage of information that, you know, isn't necessarily truthful in a lot of cases. You know, when they hear, you know, they'll throw up a picture of you know, maybe a Daria shotgun that, you know, from someone who doesn't use a firearm, they look at that and they see a, you know, a machine gun style firearm just by the visual look of things, right? So, you know, that's one of the reasons why, you know, to circle back to, you know, we were talking about how we get involved in this is, you know, that's one of the reasons why we really focus on form and function. You know, firearms shouldn't be classified by appearance. And a lot of people, you know, that don't use firearms often, you know, they hear semi-automatic, but they don't hear semi. They hear fully automatic, and, you know, then they can get on the bandwagon of, you know, yeah, that's, you know, we don't need fully automatic firearms. And then we can say, you know what, you're absolutely right. We agree too. And that's why they were banned in 1977, right? It's, you know, part of the education has to come up. But, you know, the semi-automatic conversation comes up, and this has been a conversation that's been coming up, you know, longer than C21, and it's longer than the OIC. You know, I personally see it at a municipal level all the time. And, you know, a lot of times people that are enacting you know, additional rules and regulations or restrictions, you know, they start with restriction 1, whatever that might be, and then as they draft it, you know, it can quickly change. And we see that at the municipal level all the time, where municipalities, you know, you'll be reading something, and all of a sudden semi-automatic is right into the equation. And we saw that actually just, you know, back about a year and a half ago in Toronto, when Toronto passed a bylaw that basically would, you know, ban handguns, ban sale of ammunition, and oh, by the way, banning semi-automatic firearms. Now, obviously, they didn't have any jurisdiction to do anything. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on, but that's how quickly the conversation can change. And, you know, as you said, not everyone maybe have a semi-automatic rifle, but, you know, there's a lot of folks that have a semi-automatic 22 or a semi-automatic shotgun that they use for
Right.
duck and goose hunting. So the conversation can quickly change.
Yeah, and I think especially with the semi-auto discussion, it really resonates with, it sort of bridges that gap between, you know, the gun enthusiast that's not a hunter that collects guns and has restricted firearms, and the hunter that has guns that are, you know, like I said, semi-auto. And I think the ears really perk up on hunters when they start hearing any discussion about semi-autos, because the feeling that we get from our readership is that, you know, they're interested in it, they're concerned about it, and they see it as a slippery slope that once any, you know, wedges get in there, it's going to be a direct line towards, you know, semi-auto shotguns and stuff like that too. One thing you brought up there, and it was, I want to make sure we have time to get to it because we've had a lot of questions regarding the municipal bylaws in general. So you guys used to primarily deal with the federal government when it came to firearms laws. Now you have to deal with every municipality in the province. That's got to be some fun.
Yeah, well, and you know, we've obviously for decades we've been dealing with municipalities everywhere with, you know, discharge firearm bylaws and additional opportunities, but through
now you're dealing with them on a different level
now
though,
we're
right?
now it's on a different level, obviously, with C21, where, you know, they're working to basically empower or enable municipalities to basically create a bylaw that would prohibit either, you know, just personal storage at home or storage anywhere in the municipality.
That's it's got to be pretty concerning to a lot of people. And we did have a lot of questions around it. I'll try and read off about 3 questions we had in regards to municipal bylaws. So it says, this is Robertson B from Toronto. He says, I live in Toronto. Should I be even thinking about buying a new handgun? That's an open-ended question there.
Well,
Sure.
I you know, that's I would probably, you know, I would make sure you do your research really, really well on the firearm, and maybe pause a little bit. Obviously, you know, we all know where Toronto is on this. If this goes through, this is going to cause headaches for a lot of folks.
Yeah. And one thing we were talking about, we're all 3 of us were talking about before we went live here, was about with the municipalities and how, and especially about transportation of some of these guns, right? Like if I live in, say, Oshawa or Whitby, and I'm going to go to my gun club that's in Guelph or Niagara Falls region or something like that, St. Catharines, in Toronto and, you know, Newmarket and York and all that sort of stuff have not only bans on possession on ownership of those guns, they have travel bans on it too. So how do you get from point A to point B? You know, you have to rent a boat and go along Lake Ontario, or you have to go up around Lake Simcoe, or it just seems like it's going to be some sort of logistical nightmare for a lot of people.
Yeah, the questions are definitely endless when it comes to, and the answers haven't been forthcoming. Obviously, you know, if a municipality goes that way, which basically, you know, bans storage, transportation anywhere within their jurisdiction, you know, you just labeled a few of them. You know, a lot of these municipalities also have you know, provincially CFO approved ranges. So what does that mean?
Yeah, not only for the gun owners, but for the people that have, but the people who have put vast amount of money and time and effort to make all these, you know, gun ranges legal,
well,
and ownership, right?
Yeah, that's right. Like there's so many people affected, and you know, when you start looking at the list of people that could be affected, you know, that goes right down to firearms instructors as well, who often travel to put on courses, right? So what does that mean for a firearms instructor who again is teaching, you know, a federal course? You know, how's that going to be impacted? So, you know, there's definitely a lot of unanswered questions with regards to that. are there going to be exemptions, which we highly doubt if that's the case. For folks, we feel that there's probably going to be a pretty strict guideline of who will be able to have the firearms, for transportation through those areas, and then likely be, limited to police services. But yeah, it's going to be patchwork, and ultimately it falls to the province, because as much as we say this is going to be on the municipalities, we know firsthand that anytime a municipality deals with firearms issues, it's not the bylaw officer that's going out the door to check on Patty or John that that the complaint came in. They're not equipped, they're not trained. A municipality, anytime they get a firearms issue, they pick up the phone and they call the local police service or the OPP. So ultimately any of this is going to be taxed down to the province to help enforce, because there's no way that a municipality would ever be able to enforce it, nor would they have the information of the people who are in that area.
Right, or the specialist to know exactly what we're dealing with. One other thing that gets back to municipal bylaws, because there's a number of stuff on this. I just want to touch on it while we're here, and especially because this is a trapping question, and we love trappers in the magazine. I just want to make sure we get this. Vincent F. from Thunder Bay says, storage and use of handguns for dispatching of legally trapped fur bearers under the wilderness carry. Is this going to be still allowed?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually I was very interested in this as well, because actually both Matt and I are licensed trappers as well. But through this, the ATC changes actually only relate to self-defense. So we have got confirmation that trappers will be able to remain and continue to hold on to their ATCs. So basically, trapping will continue to be recognized as a legitimate purpose for those.
That's good to hear. So what are you guys hearing? I've got a number of questions here to get to. We have a lot to try and cover tonight. But are there anything you guys are hearing that we haven't sort of covered right now?
So I don't know if you want to. I know there's actually dozens and dozens of questions in the Q&A, but maybe could pull out a few here and try and answer them before we get back to some of those questions that you have, Ray.
Sure. Let's see if we can get one.
So
I'm scrolling through. There's so many.
Yeah. There's a lot there. Congratulating you on your one-liners and other things. So I think that there's a lot of questions. If I had to kind of summarize from scrolling through, people are interested in what we're doing as a federation, and they're talking in general about the bill. There's quite a few different ones that we've been talking on and off about, and then the OIC and so I'll just assume that they're talking about the most recent one, Bill C-21, which is what you and Brian were just talking about with the municipalities and the municipal bylaws. And Brian touched on this a little bit, is that idea that we're dealing with a federal firearms issue that is now coming into municipalities where they have this opportunity to create bylaws. But then the province ultimately has jurisdiction. So this is one of those rare cases where all of a sudden, our advocacy has to focus on all three levels. So one of the things that we've done, we knew this was coming. It's been talked about in liberal platforms. It's been talked about, in government mandate letters. So, kind of before elections, during elections, after elections, it's been there all along. Municipalities and the ability to ban handguns. And so we knew it was coming. And we started to have conversations with the province to try and get an idea of, what their perspectives were on it. And I think a lot of people have heard that in the media that, that there's Premier Ford and others within the provincial government have been adamant that they believe that we would be best served in Ontario and elsewhere by having these policies focus on crime, criminals, and dealing with that sort of thing. And we've been trying to have a conversation that actually even goes beyond. Some people say, well, why spend so much time on a handgun ban? Again, coming back to that, what does it matter to OFAH? But it's, Brian referenced this earlier too, is that we have dozens and dozens of conversations a year with municipalities across the province, and we hear all of the firearms issues that are brought up in communities, and Brian deals with it related to discharge and other things. And so we wanted to have a conversation with the province, because they have jurisdiction to say, you know what, this new bylaw making power that is being given to municipalities as it relates to handguns is just symptomatic of a much bigger problem, which is you have municipalities all over the province creating different rules related to firearms, whether it's firearms discharge or in this case handguns. And we need some consistency, and it needs to be evidence-based. It needs some oversight. And we were actually recommending to the province that they have more of a hand in having that oversight to provide at least some guidelines, some threshold, some consistency, because beyond that bylaw making authority, there's nothing really there. And so one of the things that's a little different about Bill C-21 is that we're actually advocating on federal firearms issues through the province. And so I think there's a lot of alignment as far as, the way that we think about this, the way the province thinks about this, but we haven't been able to get them to actually get over that hump and do something legally to change that legislation or to provide even that policy oversight. And so we're still working on that as a way to, not have to go to hundreds of municipalities, that it would be much better if we could kind of cut that off at the pass with the province to deal with it in one spot from a policy perspective, rather than have to travel around the province and deal with all those one-offs.
Right. I'm sure it'd make it easier for everybody involved. This is getting into sort of another legal question here. And I think everybody's pretty familiar with the term Second Amendment when we're talking about south of the border. So we get a bunch of questions here. One's from Ian H. from Elliott Lake, and he asks, can we somehow change the laws in Canada to make firearms ownership a right and not a privilege?
Well, I think that, we deal with a lot of issues related to firearms that come from perceptions from the United States. I think that, where our media and our television and everything is dominated by the US. And so I think that, that comes in many different shapes and sizes. And so, outside in the media, people constantly think that, we don't have rules, and, people are walking around with guns on their hips. People believe that. They really do. And that's where a lot of the push for legislation and changes to firearms policy comes from. But it also, it kind of drives that conversation, I think, internally within the firearms community. There is a strong pressure for, having that conversation about rights. And it's constantly this conversation, just the question asked about rights versus privileges. And we're so fundamentally different in, what we have as far as a constitution and what rights we have related to firearms. It is enshrined, as you said, in the US, and it is not here. And so I think the question was more about, how do we get that?
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, there's really only one way to get that, and that's change the Constitution. And, as everyone knows that, there's limited ways to do that. That's a major endeavor from
right.
Just from the Constitution and changing the Constitution. And then, there's a lot of conversations related to court challenges related to the interpretation of the Constitution and what that means. And so the Constitution is it's funny. It's not funny. It's just, I think, something that is coming up more and more in the conversation, that people feel that when their firearms are being taken away, that they're being confiscated from people in the way that the government is saying, okay, well, we're going to prohibit firearms. And in the case of the OIC, we're not going to have the parliamentary procedure, and it's going to be, fundamentally different than the classification process that everyone's used to and what is, in law. And so, people are surprised by that, and they say, "Look, I can lose those things so quickly." Is that, I want to have protection from
Right.
that. And I think that's where that conversation comes from, is that it's that feeling of, well, if I can lose them that quickly, then we need to do something about that. And so, I mean,
Enshrined in our rights. Yeah.
that's a much bigger conversation. And I think that there's also, you know, as much as, you know, we're driven to kind of feel that way about wanting protection, is that, you know, as we see with our neighbors to the south, that, you know, those Second Amendment rights, they don't come without their challenges. And so that's something that I think Canadians would have to think long and hard about, and would have to, you'd have to have that conversation nationally. I think that we probably wouldn't be surprised that there's going to be a lot of Canadians that, you know, wouldn't support that.
Right.
And there's probably firearms owners that wouldn't support that. And so that's a big conversation to have.
We could be here for a couple of years talking about that one just alone. But this gets back into a kind of something you touched on here about rights and governments taking your stuff from it. And we get this question always about the buyback program, and the criticism we always get is from readers telling us, stop using the government term buyback. It's disinformation. Buyback sounds like a nice, helpful term. You know, we're here to give you money. We're here to help you out. We're here to, you know, buy back your guns from you. And they say this is not a buyback program. You know, this is a confiscation program. And please call it a confiscation program, right? And we have a number of questions around that. So John D from Push Lynch asks, is the government going to buy back my prohibited guns?
So I think I'll touch on, you know, the whole, you know, term buyback. One of the main reasons why we continue to use buyback is that's what the government refers to it as. And for consistency, it's always best to kind of keep using the terms that they're using, whether you like them or not, or whether we like them or not. That's the terms that they use. So that's, you know, one of the reasons why we use it. But so through the OIC, obviously they started by saying there was going to be this buyback program and grandfathering. And as time went on through the past year, you know, they were wavering on the grandfathering option. Well, we know through C21 that they have come out with, you know, a version of grandfathering, but they've also indicated that there will be a buyback program. Now, what is glaringly absent in C21 is obviously the details of said buyback program. And truthfully, it's, you know, those will be regulations that come in later on in this process. But, you know, ultimately they have, you know, these figures in their mind that they've come up with, which they will, you know, once they start to roll this out, they will be offering money for this said buyback program. It's very variable right now.
Right. So I guess we also, some of the questions that are coming in are about accessories and stuff like that. So I guess we'd have no idea of what's going to be for, if you have a prohibited gun and they're going to buy it back, how much they're going to get for it. What about all the ammunition I have for that gun, because I don't have another gun that has that caliber? What about my, you know, any add-ons like scopes and stuff like that, because I have a scope specific for that gun. I don't have a need for it for any other firearm, or is any of that, heard any rumblings about that being covered too?
Well, they're great questions, and that's actually one of the reasons why we included specific questions like that in the recent firearms survey that we did, to get a really good understanding from folks who have firearms that are affected. You know, obviously there's the cost of the firearm, but in most cases, you know, folks are putting on high-end equipment. They're buying high-end scopes. They've got specialty ammunition. There's a lot of parts that go with it that are specific to that firearm. And you know, to answer that question first, you know, we've asked that, you know, basically said that if there's going to be buyback, that's got to be part of it, because without the firearm, those in a lot of cases are useless. But we don't have clarification on that yet. They're talking about the buyback program quietly. You know, they guesstimate that there's about 150 to 200,000 newly prohibited firearms out there. It's a big range, and the reason there's a range is because truthfully they don't know.
Right.
You know, they only know the numbers of firearms that were restricted already. You know, obviously, as we know, you know, through that survey that we did, you know, we identified a whole slew of firearms that, you know, were non-restricted that have gone right to prohibited. So, you know, there's no registry for those anymore. They have no clue how many of those firearms are out there. So that's why they have such a big spread of that. And you know, when you hear the the dollar value that they're talking about. So Minister Blair has mentioned that, you know, they're looking at approximately $1,300 per firearm. That value is incredibly low in my, you know, that's just my opinion. And you know, so that leads me to believe that they're not taking into consideration, you know, all of these additional accessories. You know, I think everyone on this call tonight know, you know, we'll just use a scope, for example. You know, you can spend, you know, your kid's tuition for a couple of years on good optics. So we don't have confirmation of that yet. Is one of the questions that we're looking at. We think it's imperative that if they forge forward with this, that, you know, they have to take that into consideration. But it's been radio silence on that one in particular.
And that sort of leads into another question. Kadeep S from Brampton asks, why isn't the government going after why is the government going after legal gun owners instead of criminals? And we get asked this all the time. It says, you know, I took my hunter ed course and I took my gun safety course. I passed both written and practical tests. I had a background check with the RCMP. I pay my license fees. The RCMP has my photo and all of my information on file. I'm a responsible hunter and gun owner, yet they keep on targeting me instead of criminals. And they keep on putting, you know, they're going to talk about putting money into a buyback program instead of taking that money and putting it into, you know, policing or more public safety and health initiatives and stuff like that for dealing with those types of crimes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, ultimately, at the end of the day, licensed firearms owners is the easiest policy lever to pull. They can get the quickest reaction right there. And you know, we've been saying for years and years and years, but it seems like it's been on repeat over the last few years, and that's been through the OIC and through C71 before, that the government needs to be investing in the root causes of what we are seeing in Canada. And the root causes are not licensed firearms owners committing crimes and all these illegal acts. It's increases in gang-related violence. It's illegal firearms coming across the border. It's smuggling and trafficking. It's the lack of programs for youth who, you know, are maybe taking the wrong path. There's nothing to help guide them, you know, through what we just talked about, this buyback program. And you know, the rough figures that, you know, they're quoted in saying that it's probably only going to be $300 to $400 million. Well, $300 to $400 million is a heck of a lot of money. And just imagine the difference that could make if you actually took that money that you were going to buy back legally purchased firearms from you and I, and put it into actually fighting what, you know, Canada is facing in all these areas. Right. Think of what $300, $400 million could do in putting on some programs for youth and investing in policing and the CBSA and you know, holding the, you know, the criminals to, you know, the fullest extent of the law when they get there. Invest that money in stuff that's going to actually make a difference, and stop going after you and I. But that's, you know, I don't think it's news to anybody on this call that we, and I'm using the collective we here, licensed firearms owners are always the target, with no pun intended.
Yeah, and I can't even see, you know, if anybody's, I'm sure there's actually a few people listening here that have bought a firearm recently. I can't see, with the amount of firearms that are potentially on that buyback program, that for fair market value, that $300, $400 million is even anywhere near realistic of how much money they should be spending if it's going to go through. It's got to be a lot more than that.
Well, and I think it's, I mean, if we're being honest, it's just a cost of doing business in the sense that it's politics, right? Is that, as Brian said, if you're going to sit down and you're going to say, what's the problem? How do we need to solve it? And I got 400 million, where am I going to put it? And that's the problem we face with like firearms policy in general, is rarely is it done for the sake of, you know, fixing things and actually making things better, because it's politically charged, and there are people on all sides of this conversation kind of pushing and pulling all the time. And that's why it's like a yo-yo constantly between elections. You're like, you know, this could go really well or really bad, and you never know. And firearms is often, at least it seems like, in recent times, firearms is that wedge issue in politics. And so it's really too bad that, some of the things like, and I said this earlier about, people were probably rolling their eyes. I was talking about, bills. They tend to have, a whole number of different things that are happening, and rarely does it just tackle one thing. It's like the government in that moment in time is like, oh, well, we need to do this, and that. And, the first five things might be actual policy holes that they're like, okay, we need to fix this because, we've identified this as something that needs to happen. We may or may not agree with that. But there's an identified need, the policy intent, maybe it has some merit, maybe it makes sense on some level, maybe it, makes sense to everybody, all Canadians. But what happens is you tend to, we tend to have these things happen to us as, licensed firearms owners, where we say, like, we feel like we're being targeted. It's like there could be 8 good things in a bill, but if there's 2 really bad ones, those other 8 things don't matter.
Right.
And, some of the things that we've been pushing as a federation and the broader firearms community has been saying, like, make the penalties harsher. Do something about the criminal activity. Tackle straw purchasing. Don't tell me that illicit firearms are coming from me, in the domestic, kind of supply of firearms that are becoming illicit firearms. Tackle the issue. Don't tackle me as a licensed firearms owner hoping that it will solve the straw purchasing
Right.
issue. Tackle the straw purchasing issue. And that's one thing that they've tried to do in Bill C-21, is that they've actually tried to do something that we've been recommending, is they've got barriers right now to even communicating between police services across this country about suspicious activity that might be straw purchasing. We'll do something about that. And so that's an example of something that happens in a bill where you're like, okay, yeah, that one tiny little provision there, that could be good. And we can get behind that potentially.
Right.
But you've done all these other things in there. It's the same with the penalties. The maximum penalties increased. And we're like, okay, we've been asking for that, firearm related offenses under the criminal code. Yeah, boost those, maximum penalties. The people who are doing bad stuff, those criminals, tackle them. But the problem is that we're not sitting here talking about that. We're
Right.
talking about all the things that, we feel like we're targeted on.
No, and there's nothing. I mean, good gun laws, responsible gun laws have made this country fantastic when it comes to gun ownership, of being responsible, our safety records, and all the things that go along with it. It's not saying that everything is bad, but I agree with you. We get targeted for so much, and it's hard to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There's some good in there that can target criminal activity, but you're also penning a lot of that stuff on legal responsible gun ownership and targeting them too. So it's really difficult for the tightwater to balance on that. One of the big picture kind of questions we have with, I think, with all the stuff that's coming in today and through registration, has been like really either very specific questions about 12 gauge, 10 gauge shotguns, semi-autos, carry permits and storage, and with municipalities and stuff like that. But there's also sort of been those big issue questions, right? The big perspective questions, and you touched on it a little bit there about, it's hard to you're not just trying to change the mind of the gun community, you're trying to change the mind of municipal politicians, provincial politicians, federal politicians, and we have a challenge within the general public of Canada altogether, right? Like I talked about, the OPP officer not knowing whether his 12 gauge shotgun or his son out in the field with that was legal or not, and sort of the disinformation that's coming from some sides of the gun community. But there's also a lot of disinformation coming out there that sort of, confuses the Canadian public, at large, right? I have some friends that are pretty avid anglers. They're not hunters. They're not anti-hunters by any means, but they're just not hunters, right? And when I talk to them about sometimes firearms issues come up and stuff like that, and they say, the federal government or Trudeau is not doing a bad thing. They're banning assault rifles. You don't really need to have an AK-47 in the deer woods to go hunting, right? And that's the message they're getting. That's what they're getting out there. And then I have to spend time to discuss them about Canadian gun laws and how Trudeau's framed the single-handedly sort of framed the subject that he single-handedly banned assault rifles, and that before them there was widespread use of assault rifles throughout this country, especially by hunters. And it's just about, you know, fact and reality, or spin doctors and truth, right? And Daru from Oakville asked, we need to educate non-firearm owners to counter this misleading information presented by the media, government, anti-gun groups, etc. How can we do that?
Well, I think that's one of the roles that we try and play, and why we take the kind of positions that we do related to policies and trying to come at it from that evidence-based perspective, to like work through it and say, you know, this is the reality of the situation. If you read into any of our submissions to government on, you know, this or fishing, hunting, it's always, we break it down and we look at it and say, okay, you're trying to do this. Politically, you've said you're going to do this. That's the politics of it. But here's the reality of the policy of it. And here's what you're accomplishing. And in a lot of cases with this stuff related to firearms, it's nothing. It's honestly the policy improvements, the public safety enhancements that they talk about, that is the basis of the narrative. It doesn't exist. And it can't even be argued when you actually look at what they're doing and what they say they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is that narrative, it takes hold, and it takes hold in the public because the media latches on. And you know what, a lot of the firearms that are being shown in these conversations, they look scary to the general public. Those people that don't know firearms. I think Brian mentioned that earlier. And so you've got the narrative, you've got the imagery, and then all of a sudden the public's like, you said, right, we're doing a good thing. We're doing a good thing. It's easy to buy into that story when the government doesn't have to be accountable. They've never had to be accountable. And, you know, Brian and I would go to a standing committee, and, you know, we'd be asked a question, and, you know, we'd have an answer, and then the conversation just stops because it's very political. And the conversation that, you know, we need to have is political. I think if you look through the comments in the Q&A, people are saying, like, well, what can we do? Like, what is there that we can do? And I think that's one of those things. It's like you said, you know, every one of us should be trying to talk to our non-hunting, non-firearms owning friends and talking to them about the realities of what's happening, that automatic firearms have been prohibited, that you don't have that, you know, those large banana clip magazines that they've seen in, you know, 1980s movies, like the things that they think exist and happen, they don't. And I think that we all have, you know, the at least the baseline of knowledge to have those conversations, you know, whether it's a dinner party, and if that ever happens again, you know, if we can have, you know, these conversations, we should be all the time. But I think that it's up to an organization like the OFAH to spread that message within our community, that we have, and then beyond as much as we can, and do that with decision makers, do that with all parties, because when it comes to the politics of this, is that, you know, there are people that will, you know, they'll listen right away.
Right.
And then there's people that just based on, you know, political ideologies, they just won't listen right away. And so you have to be able to convince them that there's some merit in that. And usually we do that by that evidence-based, break it down. Okay, show me how this actually achieves what you're trying to do is as a government. And so I think that, you know, there's individual efforts that we can do, there's collective efforts, but it's always about just talking positively and having constructive dialogue. I think one of the things that, you know, even within our own community is that, I think you said it earlier, you know, everyone's kind of always at each other's throats. It's kind of like, I'm going to force you to understand my perspective so that, you know, we can have more people with my perspective to make the difference. And it doesn't, you can't overcome ideology like that. It just,
no,
they're just opposing viewpoints. And so it has to be based on that evidence.
I think the communication, the discussions that we're having now, and the discussions that we're going to be having in the future within our community are so vital and important. But I almost think that our discussions with outside of our community is even more important, right? Because people that just right now that hear what's going on, and the government says, you know, we're going to ban handguns, or we're going to ban all guns, or we're going to do this to guns, and then they just say, wow, that seems like a reasonable way to combat crime, that seems like a good thing. But if you have those discussions with those people, and then and then they start saying, well, you know what, Rick next door, he's a deer hunter, he owns a couple rifles, he's not a bad person, he doesn't commit any crime, he's a good law-abiding citizen. Why should we be banning? They're not going to just take it at face value, right? They're going to hopefully, even if we can just get some questioning in some of those minds, that saying we're not just going to be spoon-fed from what the media or what the government's telling us. We're going to at least think about if this is a rational thought.
Yeah, and one of the things that we find is that we really try and we spend a lot of our time trying to convince people that whether it's hunting, even fishing, but to a lesser extent, and especially firearms, that that we're not just trying to it's not just about us wanting to protect our lifestyle. That's a part of what we do as an organization, is that fishing, hunting, firearm use, that is a part of what we do. And so, yeah, we want to maintain that. We want that to be something that we can pass down to our children and grandchildren. We want to maintain that, and we don't want society to dictate that we can't do those things. But it's becoming increasingly hard to educate an uninformed public that is disconnected from what we do, and
Sure.
that kind of everyday lifestyle of people who fish, hunt, trap, and use firearms. And so there's such a large gap, is that it gets filled with the narratives and as you said, the spin doctors, the political narrative, and people believe governments. They believe that governments must be accountable for what they're doing, and therefore
Sure.
what they're saying must be true. And so there's a steep hill to climb.
It's tough even to make the sell to people that don't connect with fishing, like, why are you torturing fish and stuff like that. If it's a tough sell to people that won't even put a red and white bobber on and a piece of a dew worm and catch a sunfish off of a dock, if that's a tough sell to some people, firearms ownership and hunting and everything else that goes along with that, it's a pretty steep hill to climb. But it's we have to keep that dialogue going. I think there's no other option. This is a straight direct question from Thurston F from Kitchener. How does the OFH recommend its members convincing sitting governments, MPs, to amend this legislation? He doesn't mention what specific legislation, but I'm sure.
Well, I think Matt actually touched on that nicely there in the last response. But obviously, having those constructive, good conversations, writing your local MP, having the discussions at all levels, that goes right down to the municipal level right now. Start reaching out to your local councillors and your mayor, and having those good conversations, and making sure that they are aware of how you feel as their constituent. And it's always important, we've just talked about this for a number of minutes now. It's always important to have those conversations, and you can't expect people to know the answer, because that's, we've seen that's not the case anymore. So definitely start by, reaching out, having those conversations with MPs, MPPs, and, obviously we will, as an organization, we'll continue to have the conversations from an OFAH standpoint as well.
Yeah. And I think another thing too is that we sometimes just think of MPs as having to toe the government line in the case of government MPs or opposition parties, that there are those ideologies, there's those lines in the sand, and on some issues firearms is one of them where you don't necessarily cross over. But I think that you often hear stories of in particular rural MPs, that may not be the first person you would think of that would, go to bat for firearms owners. I think you'd be surprised. And if you just make an assumption about the party, and you make an assumption about the person, no matter what riding you're in, because a lot of our members, they fish and hunt, and they get outside of their own communities to do those things, but their MPs or their MPPs provincially, you know, they're in urban areas, they're in, you know, built up areas, they're all across the province. And so, you know, if everyone on this call went to their MPs, we'd cover off a lot of ground. There's hundreds of people. And I think that, you know, that one MP can make an argument within their party to say, you know what, like, we need to respect the fact that these people do these things, and you need those champions inside, and you need those people to push. And so I think that, you know, what we often think of the parties, and we often think about, you know, going to you know, Parliament Hill, and, you know, those kind of like big P politics conversations. But, you know, sometimes, you know, that conversation in your own community, you get the right person that's influential and can champion an issue for you. It just makes people think twice, you know, where they wouldn't normally. And so I encourage everyone to do that, to not hold back or make assumptions, and have those conversations.
Good. This is one thing that doesn't come up with me much at the magazine, and I'm not sure how much of it comes up with interaction with you guys at the Federation, but I know through a few friends that are into, you know, gaming and airsoft and stuff like that. There's some big discussions about changes in the gun regulations regarding the airsoft, and it's something that hunters don't even sort of recognize, that there's a big aspect of the community out there within the gun community. Alistair M from Toronto asks, he's concerned about the additional restrictions on air rifles, pistols, and airsoft guns. Is there anything that that people in that community should be aware of or be concerned about?
So this is a great question. Much like OOD, we've been getting a lot of questions about this as well. And, you know, I think the Matt talked about earlier about sometimes governments will try to, you know, close a gap with legislation. So I'll start with, you know, replica firearms. We're talking basically unregulated firearms. So firearms underneath the 500 feet per second. So they will consist of pellet gun, BB gun, and obviously airsoft has been brought into this conversation. So currently right now, unregulated firearms that exactly replicate a regulated firearm are already prohibited in that 0 to 366 feet per second range. They're already prohibited. What this section of Bill C-21 is doing, or is attempting to do, is take those remaining unregulated firearms from 366 to 500 feet per second, which obviously then become regulated firearms, and make them the exact same provisions as prohibited as the ones lesser than 366. So obviously this caused a great stir, great amount of commotion. And that, you know, pellet guns, BB guns, airsoft were going to be banned. So we obviously, you know, we started to ask some questions, and we have found out a few more tidbits of information, which I'm happy to share. And, you know, I'll preface that by saying there's still unanswered questions, but, you know, what we have found out, that any firearm or any unregulated firearm gun in this situation, so 366 to 500 feet per second,
Right,
must exactly replicate make and model, and that's the key term, make and model of an already regulated firearm. So that obviously opens up the door. There's still lots of questions, and we're trying to get more feedback. You know, does the replica firearm have to be stamped with the make and model of the regulated firearm and all that sort of stuff? But it has to exactly replicate a firearm, a regulated firearm, so over 500 feet per second, that has that includes the make and model. Now, we know that there are going to be guns, airsoft guns, pellet guns, whatever the case may be, caught up in this regulation, 100%, you know, without a doubt. What we also have learned is, you know, what the intent of the government here is to do is basically cut the head off the snake. This is really targeted, again, no pun intended. This is really focused, I'll use that word, at the industry level. So with that, you know, if somebody has an unregulated air gun that falls within that exact replica of a regulated firearm and it's going to be deemed prohibited, there's actually very minimal regulations going to be put on you as an owner. You're still going to be able to use it. You're still going to be able to transport it, and you're still going to be able to store it. The restrictions that will be on the individual is you won't be able to sell it, and you won't be able to bequeath it, so you won't be able to pass it on. Now, that's obviously still causes a great deal of number of questions and a lot of issues because there are going to be those air guns that are caught up in that. But it does need to exactly replicate by make and model for those firearms.
Okay, thanks. That helped clear a lot for me, anyways. I'm not sure if there's any lawyers with us here tonight, but this is a question that should make them happy. Is the OFH planning to get involved in any of the court challenges that are ongoing?
Yeah, and I did see there was a question in the Q&A related to that, and so the OFH has not taken action against the government in any sort of court challenges, and so we're not a party to anything that is happening in the federal court system. And there's a number of cases that have all kind of come together. We are, however, involved in and have been asked in multiple cases to, provide support as far as, our kind of knowledge and expertise related to the use of these firearms for hunting. And so, there's a lot of people coming into this conversation. There's groups, there's individuals, there's organizations that are taking on the government in court. And one of the major things that was rolled out with the OIC bans last year was it said that, these firearms, they don't have a purpose or a significant purpose for hunting or sport shooting, which, right away everyone goes, well, that's what the firearms are used for. So, how does that make sense?
Right.
And so one of the major things that, it comes out, it's actually in a lot of the questions in the Q&A. One thing that I wanted to come back to, so I'm glad you asked a question that kind of allowed us to talk about this a little bit, is that, so yes, we're getting involved from, trying to provide that kind of niche expertise that we have in this argument that ends up being a very pivotal question and conversation, which is, are these used for hunting? And a lot of the reason that, you started with that kind of conversation around divisiveness, a lot of people within the organization have been asking us, well, why are we involved with, the OIC bans? Why do we care about military style firearms, as the government's calling them? Why would we get involved in, providing that kind of information into these court challenges related to those prohibitions? Why are we getting involved in C-21 where they're talking about handgun bans and everything else? Is that, when we talk about those OIC firearms that, you think military style firearms, as the government's laid it out, you think they're not used for hunting. And you've kind of touched on that a number of times, but we knew that some of those firearms that were prohibited were used for hunting. And so I think it was last spring, maybe it was in May or June of last year, after the prohibitions were announced, we went out to people across Canada and we said, tell us how you're using these firearms. And so we did a survey. And we actually found that of the prohibited firearms that we knew of at that time, and the list has grown, is that there was 64 firearms, I believed, that Canadians were using for hunting. And I think more than half of them were actually used. So I think it was 55 of them were identified as, primarily used for hunting. And even over half of them were used, for two hunting purposes primarily. And so they weren't just, firearms that could be used for hunting. People were saying these are firearms that are being used for hunting in Canada, right, for these variety of purposes. And we have no way to, we can't validate whether those people are telling us the truth, but we started to see trends in the different firearms and what they were used for. And that gave us confidence that yes, Canadians are using these firearms because it could be the accuracy of the firearm. It could be the caliber of the firearm is appropriate for hunting certain things. A lot of them were used for varmint guns. Right. And so we really took that to the next level and we said, okay, well, Canadians are telling us that. Let's do a deep dive and let's actually assess, hunting and how the firearms that were prohibited were actually used for hunting. And so in some of the reporting that we're doing to, help support the idea that these firearms were used for hunting prior to the prohibitions, we actually went back into the history. You talked about the military origins before, differentiating between, what is military or, military grade as, advertised and marketed,
Right.
and what's actually used for the military are two different things. We got into all those details about trying to say the things that hunters want in a firearm and the availability of calibers and things that are out there, they match up and they align. There's only so many calibers. There's only so many, actions of firearms. There's only so many things. And, for the most part, they're used that way. And so it's, I think there's a common misconception that there was no non-restricted firearms that were prohibited. And, we got pictures from all over Canada from people using the firearms. They pictured the firearm, with a harvested animal, and it was
Right.
striking because it was there. And so someone in the Q&A actually asked a question tonight. I saw there, and I'm paraphrasing, but they said, how many members does this affect? How many members, for hunting actually use these firearms? And I have no way to quantify how many members. But we do know that members are using these firearms that were prohibited last year for hunting because they told us, they showed us pictures. They've, we've really gone into the kind of, I guess, background and thinking around, these firearms and what they're used for, or what they could be used for. And it just makes sense that, these firearms were used in hunting just because they share common hunting cartridges, the
Sure.
availability that we have across Canada. There was a lot of kind of factors that were showing us that, okay, what these people are telling us makes sense as far as these firearms. Some of them we knew right away, like the Ruger Mini 14 and others. It's commonly known that they're used
Yeah.
for hunting. But some of the other firearms that people may say they're obscure or hunters weren't regularly using them. The reality is that hunters were using them. How many hunters,
Yeah.
I don't know, but that gets into that conversation around, where do you start and stop with what is a hunting firearm?
Sure.
If 100 people use it, is it a hunting firearm, or do we have to have a critical mass of 10,000 people?
I can't tell you how many emails we've had in the last year about the Ruger, specifically about the Ruger, over any other firearm than that Ruger Mini 14. That's been the one that seems to be pushed a lot of buttons for a lot of our readers. So it's
Well, this is why I kind of chuckled, Ray, when you asked the question at the start with regards to shotguns. Is my shotgun banned? This is a prime example. One of the shotguns that Matt was talking about, people sending pictures, was the Derya MK12, and people were using that firearm. They were using that shotgun for hunting purposes, right? And it's a 12 gauge shotgun, so it kind of full circle.
Yeah, for sure. This one's coming from the live feed from Bob T, and he asked, Matt, in your lobbying efforts, are you seeing any flexibility with the federal government in adjusting Bill C-21?
So, I would say yes. And then, if anyone read the headlines in the last 24 hours, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, came out and said that he was actually, open-minded to going the other way and making, the buyback mandatory. And so it's a constant kind of push and pull. And I think that right now we're kind of relying on some of those kind of initial early kind of feelings towards it, and people on all sides of the house, especially the opposition, are trying to figure out what it means, what it looks like. And we really hope that we'll have an opportunity to have some direct dialogue across party lines at things like a standing committee to discuss some of the concerns that we have, some of the issues that we have, and get some traction. It's a minority government. Usually that would give us the impression that there's room for movement. All parties in opposition, save the Conservatives, have been supportive of Bill C-21 in kind of early statements on it. And so that doesn't give the government, that even if it's a minority government, much incentive to make changes. And so we're going to continue to push, but I think with firearms, it's always an uphill battle. We went to both the House of Commons and Senate standing committees. We had numerous conversation with government MPs, particularly those rural MPs, and had good conversations about the concerns. Their constituents share those concerns. Our members are their constituents, but it didn't change anything. And I talked a little bit about some of the changes that we're seeing in C21, some of the kind of throw in positive things related to max penalties, related to straw purchasing, specific offenses related to altering a magazine, to
Sure.
altering magazine capacity. That, I mean, those are good things, but the fundamental issues within the bill remain the same, and those are also platform issues for the government. Governments rarely go backwards on platform issues that they've campaigned on, put in mandate letters, they want to execute.
And if anybody should know that, you should know that. Neil D asks, is the OFAH working with your counterparts in other provinces in Canada for a Canada-wide approach to the federal government policies legislation?
So the quick answer is yes. We work with our affiliates on a number of issues, not just firearms, especially those with national importance. We have not connected directly with our affiliates on C21, but did work actively through the National Fishing and Hunting Collaborative that the OFAH leads. And we've had really good conversations, I think, about some of these things that we've talked about tonight, the challenges we face as hunting organizations in these broader conversations that kind of push and pull within our membership. But also, through that, we do get the strength of almost 400,000 Canadians, and that can be very powerful if we can go with that kind of national voice and that many members, and come together on that common ground that we can find, and we've been successful in doing that. And so that's one thing that we want to do on C21 before we get into any sort of progression of the bill and get into standing committee presentations and testimony and those sort of things, is that we'd really like to have that national support.
And I think I would just add that this is, it's the same approach as when we started to work on Bill C71 as well. We had to have a good understanding of what the legislation meant. And once we as an organization, formulated our response, that's when we went out to our affiliates, and it garnered, obviously support, with after the first phone call with our partners. So we suspect that it would be similar here, but it's the same approach. We'll get our position formulated and dissect it, and then present it to them.
Good. And on communication level, though, we're coming here from some questions online. Kuldeep Singh he's asking, please make it convenient to educate the general public about the firearms laws in control of Canada, so they should be not compared with the US. There must be a strong campaign on social media. And he also asked, I think further down in here, you need OFAH to make more media stuff available to educate people. So I know I mentioned at the beginning of it that the OFAH is a YouTube channel, and there's a fair amount of content on there now, and this is going to be on there, and I'm assuming you're going to be doing more stuff in the future and using that media to get out. Yeah. Okay, this is one of those big questions here, and I've heard it from a number of people, and it's one I think on everybody's mind. And Steve B from Barrie writes in, basically, what's next? What is the government looking to take away next?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to that, one of the original conversations we were having related to, why we're involved in this, is that, for starters, that, it does affect hunting firearms, how many hunting firearms, and how many people use those firearms. That's a conversation that, I think is hard to really wrestle down and say, where's that line that we draw in, representing those interests, and that, I think, gets to that bigger question, and kind of what you're leading to is, it's that idea of bad policy breeds bad policy. And, a lot of people are concerned with, you use an OIC to do something, then what happens the next time, someone wants to ban something without going through that parliamentary procedure? Is there's some, there's a precedence for that. And so,
right.
I think that, those are the concerns that people have, is, it seems almost easier to ban firearms, to take away some of those things that, you know, we've maybe never been concerned about or thought about, or the people that aren't concerned right now, you know, might be concerned in the future. And so we've talked a lot about semi-automatics. They get dragged in the conversation because they have the word automatic. And so I think that that's something that we're always concerned that,
Mhm.
you know, people don't understand what a semi-automatic is. They just hear automatic. And so I think that that's something that we have to be concerned about. But it's just, you know, it's not even that. It's you know, magazine capacity and thinking about you know, how many cartridges or shells you can have, and how many you need, and it gets back to that sort of kind of divisive conversations that we have within our own membership, is that, you know, you have ideologies within, you know, the hunting community about what firearms should be used when, and, you know, should semi-automatics be used, and, you know, some people like to use muzzle loaders and muzzle loaders only, and some people, you know, prefer you know, the kind of lever action shotgun, some, or sorry, lever action rifles, and other people want semi-automatics. And so there's this huge kind of divergence, you know, within you know, our own
It's
community, so that
it's
that
tough because even when we do stuff on bow hunting, we do some content on crossbows, and we get letters from vertical bow hunters that just say, you know, that's not a bow. Don't be putting that stuff in the magazine, because a crossbow isn't a bow. It's basically a shotgun with an arrow. And then you have to have these conversations about it. And it just seems these conversations are important. They're time consuming for a lot of us, but I think they're important. But it's tough to stem that tide of infighting amongst us. Not to harp on on something that came up from the beginning, but it's just a reality, right? It's a reality for me, and I know it's a reality for you guys.
yes. So I think the only thing that, you know, I would add, if we were to say um you know, what's next, is I think that it's not what's next just at the federal level. I think now we have concerns about, you know, what will happen when you can have, you know, a bylaw to, you know, change the way that people store, transport handguns. You know, what will be next? There's now a mechanism, or at least a proposed mechanism, to do that. And so I think the one thing that, you know, the OIC ban and Bill C-21 have done, have kind of opened up, you know, the concerns, and, you know, it seems to be more angles for I'll say unfriendly governments from a firearms perspective to, you know, challenge the way that we want to live our lives, and how we want to use firearms. And there's more and more ways that they can seemingly do that without, you know, what we would consider to be traditional procedure. And I think that, that's what we should be concerned about, because that's not about, you know, what's the single next thing. It's that those can be used to do any number of things. So I think it's more that concerns me than, you know, tackling or targeting, you know, one specific thing.
Sure. We've covered off a lot here. Do you think is there any feedback that you're getting from members that you think we sort of missed here, or is there start looking at sort of ways to kind of look at some bigger questions to wrap this up?
Yeah, and so I'm just taking a quick look through.
I'll
There's
be trying to scan through the Q&As as we're going along here and keep track of your answers and look for other questions. There's a few of them in here.
Yeah, and so and some of them are you know, very long, and one thing that, you know, we'll try and do is we'll try and answer, you know, some of these questions you know, through our FAQs and other things that we do, that we talked about earlier, is that, you know, there's some very specific questions that people have in here. You know, it's like, I have this firearm, you know, what do the prohibitions mean for this? And so then there's other people who have asked questions that are, you know, kind of spin-offs of maybe what, you know, we've talked about already. You know, one of the things that seems to be, I would say, it's a common thread in here. And rather than try and tackle one of them, I'll just paraphrase rather than try and look for it, is that
Sure.
people are, I think people are concerned, you know, I talked about this off the top, related to, you know, like, what is OFH doing, right? And you can see it in the comments. There are people, you know, I'm seeing it all. They're saying, you know, like, you know, how does this affect OFH members? You know, why are we involved in this conversation? And then you're hearing people saying, why is OFH supporting this bill? And, we're seeing that in the interpretations of the things that we're saying, and, the way that people are looking at this, the perspectives that they have. And I can guarantee you that on the call tonight, there's that whole spectrum is there of people who, have those different feelings and beliefs. And I just want to reiterate that, we are continuing to push back against this. And I think that it's not an expectation. It's not lost on us that the expectation from some people is that we're going to come out and we're going to say, we oppose this bill, support this bill, or, be very, kind of blunt with our, early positioning. Is that, we're still looking through, as Brian mentioned multiple times, trying to get answers to some of these questions. It's a complex bill. There's a lot in it that we still don't fully understand, and we don't understand the implications. And coming out and having that kind of, visceral kind of reaction to it is what we want to do. But it's never been the process or policy that we've taken, is that we want to really look through it and we want to figure it out. We want to know how it's going to affect members, and we want to be able to advocate for all of those people that are looking at it from every different angle. And you can rest assured that we're going to do that. We are going to, turn this bill upside down. We're going to take every opportunity we can to have conversations with politicians, with standing committees in the public about where we have concerns with the bill. And we'll continue to operate the way that we've done with bills in the past, and we've been effective in being able to have those conversations. We don't always get the outcome we want, but we aren't going to be as vocal in being for or against the powers that be, the people that are in positions of power. We can't be partisan as an organization. It's not something that we can do or would do. Because, as I talked about earlier, we want to have the conversations all across the board, and we don't want this to be about politics, although that's what drives it.
We want
to cut through that.
Yeah, it could easily be that way, and I know it's easy to fall into it, because I feel like everybody here that's with us tonight understands that we've been trampled on by a number of people in politics, but we've also been trampled on from every party and from all different walks of life. So just to point fingers at a few people all the time, sure, but it doesn't. Our bigger fight is with trying to secure a future for firearms ownership in the country, and that comes back to a question, trying to bring this full circle and wrap it up here. And Trevor from Hamilton asks, what does the future look like for owners of firearms in Canada? That's a
loaded question.
I didn't want to end it with an easy one.
Yeah, I think someone actually wrote in the Q&A. I saw something about this is an uphill battle. I think people are feeling very negative about it. And just leading into, or kind of back into that conversation we just had about politics, is that if we look back to not that long ago, when the long gun registry was ended, is that we had a number of years there where firearms policy seemed to be heading in a direction that was positive, or at least it was, getting us back to, where we thought maybe we should be after,
right,
some negative things happening over the years, over the decades. And so I think that, it's if you get caught up in the moment, meaning that, if you're trying to, only focus on this bill and try and, go at it, at all costs, is that you sometimes you lose sight of that. Okay, well, we're never going to stop firearms bills from happening. It's going to continue to be about politics. It's going to continue to drive the political agenda. There's going to continue to be firearms bills, good and bad, over the years, and things are going to ebb and flow. It's a yo-yo. And one of the reasons that, we kind of take that, evidence-based middle ground, let's not worry about, all the noise around us, and just attack the bill. Let's attack the bill and the underpinnings of that bill, and, undermine, what's in there that doesn't make sense based on the evidence that's there. And that's something that, no matter what, people can't argue with. And so we have to work on these bills that come and go with different parties, different governments, and kind of different, um, I guess, societal kind of feelings about firearms.
Mhm.
And we have to keep that steadiness in the conversation. Is that I think the higher you get and the higher you get, the lower you go the next time, and vice versa. And that's a very deflating thing as a firearms owner. And I think we're feeling that. I think you see it in the comments and the way,
Sure.
people are talking about it, the questions they're asking, the way Brian and I feel at the end of the day talking about firearms. It can
A
feel
bit
very,
deflating, can it?
yeah, negative, and it is
Yeah.
deflating. And so I think that it's that
But it's a
steadiness.
marathon, not a sprint though. I think if you I think for me anyways, if you're very narrow focused and just looking at the pie in front of you, it can be a bit negative and a bit deflating. But if you, like you're saying, looking back to the end of the long gun registry, and you kind of look at our history, at least over the past 10, 15 years or something like that, there are those ups and downs, right? And hopefully we're probably in one of those down cycle things now, but hopefully if you keep on that evidence-based approach and attacking this stuff that is not fair and honest to our gun owners, that there will be more ups in the future, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't. I don't want to lead people to believe that it doesn't cause us to pull any punches. We're still going to push back against all the negative things that are in the bill. It's just that we do that in a different way than people may see in other areas of the community, and that it's not our intention to be like that. In that we're trying to create a dialogue that is constructive, and we want to try and push back against it, and scrape and claw as much as we can to try and get it so that some of these really negative things aren't going to kind of permanently hurt the firearms community. And that's some of the challenge of it, is that you got to play that kind of long game to say how do we think about the changes that are happening right now and what that's going to mean for people today, next year, 2 years from now, and 10 years from now, and try and figure out a strategy that's going to minimize any sort of negative damage to the firearms community as a whole.
Good. That might be your final thought. We're trying to wrap it up here. It's coming up to the 2 hour mark, up to 9 o'clock. And I think we covered a lot of ground here tonight. If I had to wrap it up in my final thoughts and paring it down to one issue, it's a tough ask, but it would probably be that it's obviously very apparent that communication amongst all gun owners is a positive thing, but we need more of it. And I think, virtual events like this tonight are definitely a positive aspect to it. There's a number of other ways we can have the discussions within our own community and outside our communities. Is there anything you guys want to add as some sort of final thoughts to wrap this up?
I would just say that I think that it does, there's hardly something that happens in federal firearms policy that doesn't affect the hunting community. And that seems to be kind of a point in this conversation that we're really hinging on, right? Is how does this affect hunting, and why are we involved in this conversation? And I think that what it does, and that this doesn't change the way that OFH presents itself as we're a hunting organization that has a strong interest in firearms because of what the changes in firearms policy will mean for our members. And so we don't get involved in this to tackle we don't want to get into a conversation because it's about military style firearms. We don't want to get into a conversation because it's about handguns. We get into a conversation around firearms policy because we think, and in often cases, we know that it's going to have effects on our membership, and in
Right.
particular, people who use firearms for hunting, whether it is direct, and in almost all cases, there is some direct tie, and it affects hunters and the hunting community. But in almost every case, it has those indirect effects, and there's going to be things that are going to come around, whether it's that thin edge of the wedge, slippery slope,
Mhm.
however you want to describe it, is that
6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
it
It's all
that
they're all tied in there somehow, right? Like you can't. It's like Jenga. You can't pull one without affecting something else in there, right? And
yeah.
and it's It's just our reality.
So it doesn't change who we are.
No.
And I think that, people are trying to, either change who we are in some cases, and kind of, push us one direction or the other. And others are questioning who we are because of the conversations we're having around firearms. And I don't think it changes anything, is that we just need people to be open to, the conversation and understanding why we're involved. And, we're happy to have those conversations with our members. We feel strongly that, firearms policy is something that, really impacts the hunting community. And we want to make sure that we're leaders in the dialogue related to how firearms policy affects our membership, the broader hunting community. And so we're going to continue to do that, and do it in a very similar way that we've been doing. I don't think people, will expect any, strong kind of left turns like you did to us in the beginning after, all the jokes to open things up.
I just kind of ease you guys into it easily so I can hit you with a few hard punches, but thanks for everything. Do you want to add anything there, Brian?
Well, I was just going to say that, I think it's important for everyone to realize that, with firearms, everyone has a personal preference. And, whether it be traditional wood stock or black synthetic, whether it be a specific action, at the end of the day, we're talking about firearms that folks are licensed to have. We've passed courses. The firearms are legal to use, and that, it kind of gets back to that whole divisiveness and, working together. That, I think the biggest take home is, just because, you may not use a particular firearm doesn't mean it's bad, and doesn't mean that someone else shouldn't use it. Just like someone who is using, a specific recreational shooter who doesn't hunt, and wouldn't use a traditional, I'll use, 760 or 7600. Everyone's personal preference is okay. And that's what makes, we talked about it earlier, is that's why we feel we're in a good position, because we can have those conversations with everyone. So, it's kind of like play nice in the sandbox, and let's work at, tackling the things that we can tackle.
True words. Well, thank you, Matt, Brian, and behind the scenes, Sean Galley, for putting this all together. And thank you for all that participated in this event. Your time, input, and support is greatly appreciated.